Hi, so this month is Women in Translation Month, in which we talk about, read, and celebrate books and works of literature written by women in other languages that were translated into English. I have not read a lot of translated literature, unfortunately, but the few that I've read have been great, and a good chunk of the translated fiction that I've read have been by women authors. So today I selected 5 works of translated fiction that I think you should definitely read, and even though a good bit of the month has finished, these books are actually quite short and easy to get through. I guarantee you could read all of these in one sitting. The first book I'll recommend was translated from Spanish. It's called Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez, which was translated from Spanish by Megan McDowell. This is a collection of short stories that all take place in Argentina, and particularly Buenos Aires in the 1990s. It very covertly addresses the political situation in Argentina at the time. Doesn't talk about it explicitly, but it uses horror and the supernatural to kind of allegorize what was happening in the society at the time, right? While this book is technically horror, it's not very scary, so if you are the faint of heart like myself, you could probably read this book, though I will say that a couple of the stories in here did give me the creeps. Some of them are just macabre and very unsettling, others are flat out supernatural and a little spooky dooky. But for the most part, they're really intriguing and they give insight into a society through a very unique and interesting lens. I would highly recommend that you give this a read. Next up, we have Sky Burial by Xinran, which was translated from Chinese by Julia something and Esther something. Julia Lovell and Esther Tildesi. So this is a book that I believe was somewhat inspired by a true story. The author met a woman who told her story, and then I think she kind of based the book off of that woman's story. It's the story of a woman who, in the 1950s, I believe this book is set. Let me confirm, it's been a while since I reread, so it's in the 1950s, and her husband was part of the Chinese military, and he was on a mission in Tibet, and she got news that he passed away, but she doesn't believe that, so she decides to journey to Tibet for herself to go look for him, and she ends up living in Tibet with a family for 30 years. And in doing so, she ends up kind of adopting Tibetan culture. She becomes Tibetan herself. Okay, welcome to Trinidad and Tobago, everybody. Anyway, so she basically becomes Tibetan herself. She adopts Tibetan culture. And it's her story of still searching for her husband while she's living there, but finding a new meaning in life, finding a new way of life that resonates with her and that changes her soul completely. This was such a beautiful exploration of Tibetan culture, but also the Tibetan landscape. It's just an absolutely stunning read, and I would highly recommend that you pick it up. The next book is The Hen Who Dreamed She Could Fly by Sunmi Hwang, which was translated from Korean by Cheong Kim. From what I understand, I think this is a very popular book in Korea, and I think it was even made into like a children's movie or show. But it's essentially the story of this chicken who is a layer on a farm, and all she does is like lay infertile eggs, and she looks out of the window and she looks at the other chickens that live in the barn, and she looks at them with envy. She wants to get out of the laying house and she wants to be free and live with the people in the barn, not the people, the chickens in the barn, and she wants to lay her own fertile egg and raise her own baby. And she ends up running away one day. She goes to the barn and be like, hey,
how y'all doing?
I want to be with y'all. And they're like, ew, you're a layer. You're supposed to be like in the hen house. What you doing here? And so she ends up running away and living in the forest, and she's living on the fringes of society, and there's this like weasel trying to eat her, and she ends up finding an egg that she kind of adopts, and it's about her story. It's a really interesting book because what it does is it kind of allegorizes the experience of people who have to live on the fringes of society. I could not help but reading this through both a feminist and a queer lens. I keep thinking about like queer people who do not feel safe or comfortable where they are, where they're being raised, or where they live, and they go and they try to find community with other people, but they're also rejected. You're rejected at home and you're rejected in the outside world, so you kind of have to pave your own way. You kind of have to live on the fringes of society. And this book, I just could not help but think of that as I was reading it. It's an interesting story. story, I wouldn't say it's inspired by Animal Farm, but I couldn't help but think of Animal Farm while I was reading it, because it is a story that uses a farm to allegorize, real life problems and issues. But whereas Animal Farm does it in this, macro sort of way to comment on societal structures and economic structures, this book kind of inverts that, and it looks at it in a micro kind of way to look at the individual experience. I really enjoyed that. I thought it was a fascinating book. It's a good pair with Animal Farm if you like that book, if you like any book that sort of takes animals and kind of try to tell a story about humans through animals' experiences. It's fascinating. It's a story about chosen family, it's a story about rejection, it's a story about paving your own way, and it's really beautiful. I read it in one go, sitting down in my hammock, lying down in my hammock, and it was great. It was fantastic. The last two books I have to talk about are actually both translated from Arabic, the first of which is Minor Detail by Adania Shibli, which was translated by Elizabeth Jaquette. I read this earlier this year and I have talked about it in a couple of my videos. I loved this book. It is a very sad and difficult and dark book to read. The book is essentially just two stories. The first 50 pages is one story, and the last 50 pages is a completely different story. It's only 100 pages long. In the first 50 pages, we are being told the story through the lens of a very horrible person, an Israeli settler in the Nakab Desert, who in 1949 carries a bunch of people out into the desert with the aim of cleansing the desert of the remaining Arabs. So they end up finding a Bedouin tribe who they basically murder, with the exception of one girl who they take back to their tents, and they abuse her horribly before eventually murdering her. And none of this is spoilers, because that was actually based off of a true story, like that actually happened. So it's a fictionalized retelling of that story. The second half of the book is a completely fictional story about a woman from modern day Ramallah, I want to say. It feels more like maybe like 2010s or early 2000s maybe. I just say that because there wasn't like a lot of like cell phones and stuff that we have today, but it also felt very much modern, so it kind of felt like the early 2000s anyway. So it's about her kind of becoming obsessed with the story of the Bedouin girl who was murdered in the Nakab Desert, and she decides to take a car and try to go there herself to try and find the spot where the girl was murdered. And she ends up going on this whole like runabout from Ramallah, leaving the West Bank, going to Tel Aviv, driving down to where the desert is, and having a like this sort of like visceral urge and desire to find where this girl was and where she died. What this second half of the story does is give you a really interesting insight into the landscape of Palestine, of historic Palestine. The narrative gives you a lot of detail on the actual like locations and highways and spots that the character is driving through and stuff. And I decided to kind of follow along with the character through Google Maps, and she's describing, oh, this so-and-so such and such place, and this used to be this village and is now an Israeli settlement. And it's interesting to kind of see her point out these Israeli settlements on the map, and you're seeing it on Google Maps, but then she's saying it used to be this village. So it's like you're on this journey with her and you're also learning from her at the same time. It's fascinating. It's such a fascinating read, and I can't recommend it enough. It's also a very controversial book. It was supposed to win an award in Germany, I believe, but because the author was speaking up about what's currently happening in Gaza, the book lost the award. Like, they took it away from her, and it caused a huge controversy. Reads with Rachel did a good video on that if you want to learn a little bit more about it. I think it's really important to support books like this, books that people are actively trying to silence. So if you read one book from this list, read this one. The last book I have to talk about is actually a graphic novel, and it's called Shubeik Lubeik by Deena Mohammed. I talked about this in my July wrap-up, so I don't want to go too much into it, but it's basically a story that takes place in Cairo in an alternate world where you can buy wishes in bottles, and depending on how expensive the wish is, the more accurate your wish will be. But if you buy a cheap wish, you're more likely to have your wish backfire on you. Kind of like the whole thing of like, you have to be careful about how you make wishes to genies, because they'll, give you like a scam or something, and you'll end up with like 3 legs or something. And I thought that that's what this book was going to explore alone, but it actually ended up being such a fascinating, first of all, exploration of Egyptian culture and society and even history, but it also delves into questioning, okay, like, let's entertain this idea for a second. If wishes were something that really did exist in our world as we know our world today, how different would our world look, or how much the same it would look. Wishes would probably be regulated by the government, by international law. Better wishes would probably be more accessible to people who have more money, who are more privileged. And also, how would bureaucracy look with like regulating people's wishes and wish buying? How would wishes intersect with things like mental health and religion? The book delves into that in such interesting ways, and it's so good. I don't know who translated it. I believe it was Deena Mohammed herself, and the book goes from right to left, kind of like a manga, because as I said in my July wrap-up, obviously Arabic is also like Japanese written from right to left, so it's just such an amazing reading experience. Like, if you want to read a fantastic graphic novel, I cannot recommend this enough. And these are the books that I will be recommending to you all for Women in Translation. Please prioritize reading translated fiction, and prioritize reading it from the perspective of people who don't often get to have their stories told. We are really privileged to be able to have access to such amazing stories. If these books were not translated, we would not be able to read them. I would not be able to read them. It is a privilege that we are able to have these people who do this incredible work for us, to have us have access to more incredible stories. So, yeah. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely, lovely day, and until next time, inshallah, keep reading.